My dad told me today that during Prohibition in the 20s, my grandma was a truck driver and to make ends meet she transported booze to the local speakeasies from the moonshiners. What's the most bad butt thing your grandparents have done? My grandpa was a pilot in World War II. During the war he shot and destroyed a German submarine. Turns out that some of those Germans survived that attack, and in the late 90s my grandpa traveled to Germany and met one of them. They had tea. Correction. He was actually a navigator on a B-24. I thought the story would end with him finishing the job, but tea is nice, too. My grandpa went in for a physical for the World War II draft and was laughed out of the doctor's office for being too tall. You think we have uniforms to fit you? He is 6'8". He was a minor league baseball player and struck out Satchel Paige. Had a tryout with the White Sox and the Braves, but his mom wouldn't let him go. Learned to use the internet at the age of 85. When he was 87 his wife died and he learned to cook. He mailed me a strawberry rhubarb pie to my dorm room at school when he was 89 and had just learned to bake pies. It was delicious. A few weeks ago, my dad took him to visit an assisted living facility and he turned it down because he didn't want to live in a den of elderly people. He is 92 and still going strong. I think your grandpa is cutting onions near where I'm. My grandfather lied about his age to be able to join the Navy in World War II. He survived 2 shipwrecks, once spending a night in the ocean surrounded by sharks and Japanese planes dropping bombs before he was finally rescued. Both grandfathers were in World War II. One got 2 Purple Hearts. The other didn't see combat, but he was one of the guys who had to write the letters to the families of those that weren't coming home. When he returned, he told my grandmother, "Never ask me to attend a funeral, ever," and she never did. Always thought that was awesome how respectful of his wishes she was until his last days. My great grandpa got his middle finger shot off in World War II when he was smoking at night. My grandmother was tiny, very elegant, very well spoken and had perfect manners. She whizzed around London during the Blitz in a converted horse box that was a makeshift ambulance. Messed up her eyesight because all she could see out of was a small slit to avoid any light getting out. Yep, my impeccable grandmother was awesome. Swiss grandmother worked in the Red Cross. Go World War II nurse grandmothers. My grandmother was a teacher in North Korea before the war. She taught Japanese. Once the war started, the communists targeted the educated, such as teachers. She ran barefoot for miles and miles until she safely crossed the border, then beating my grandfather who was running from the war as well. He was targeted too because he ran away from serving in the North Korean military. Impending our Pyongyang ban. I bet they are really glad they made that decision. My granddad was a butcher in Scotland and owned one of the most popular shops in the city. The line often went outside of the shop, so people had to wait outside. One day a guy stole a woman's handbag outside of his shop. My granddad immediately ran outside and chased after him. When he caught up to him and tackled him to the ground, the robber had terror in his face and immediately gave the bag back and ran away. My granddad couldn't figure out why he was so scared until he looked down at his hand. The entire time he had been chasing this guy, he had a meat cleaver in his hand. My grandpa, coming from an extremely Italian family, just recently told me a story about when he was younger and worked on his father's farm, living near the city, NYC I believe. They'd take their crops into the market and sell them for profit money for the fam. The mafia got word that my grandpa's father's farm was doing very well and eventually a member came to the farm demanding a cut of the profit or else he'll have the farm burned down and everyone killed. He told them he'd be back with a couple other members to collect the cash in about a week. As the week passes and the crops were sold, the mafia members finally come to collect the profit. The mafia members were not aware that my grandpa, great-grandpa, and great-uncle were waiting with guns drawn for the members to arrive. When they finally did arrive they opened fire, killing every member who came to collect the money. To hide the bodies they buried them in one of the farm's ponds. TLDR. Grandpa was a farmer, sold crops. Mafia wanted cut of profit but instead, Grandpa and company massacred the mafia members, hid the bodies and got away with it. Normally the mob doesn't let people get away with stuff like that. I'm glad your relatives were fortunate enough to fight off those gangsters. My grandpa was a nationalist activist in China when the communists were taking over. He and my grandma were about to escape to Taiwan, but right before they boarded the ship, the communist activists attacked the area, and he lost grandma in the commotion. He could have gotten on that ship, which was just departing, but he wasn't about to leave to Taiwan without my pregnant grandmother. He didn't board, and was immediately captured. He spent months in prison, tortured daily for names of his comrades. He was never killed because he was a trained surgeon and the communist army needed somebody with medical skills, so he would alternate between tending to his enemies and being tortured. He began sharpening his copper buttons on the prison floor, and one day when he managed to sharpen them enough, he slit his wrists and arteries off his neck. While he was bleeding to death, he was discovered and recovered, only to be tortured some more. He later was released and reunited with my grandmother. He also faced a lot of discrimination after that for having a nationalist background. He passed away 3 years ago. When I was little, I would trace his faint scars on his wrists and neck and ask him about it. I asked him how he could offer medical assistance to enemies who tortured him. He said no matter who it is, heal the wounded and rescue the dying. I am a doctor. He is one of the strongest men I know. Man, that quote hit me really hard. IDKY. ZMY honorary grandfather, who was my real grandfather's best friend, is a gay man and he loved my grandfather his entire life. My grandfather was married and straight, but he never stopped being best friends with him, and I'm pretty sure he knew that his friend was not going to ever get married. For his entire life this man stayed best friends with my grandfather, and when my grandfather died, this man was there as always. I'm not saying this is anything super heroic or badass, but this is the sweetest and most quiet man I know, and the most faithful man alive. And my grandfather was not the easiest man in the world to be best friends with. So anyways, I think his whole life was both tragic and heroic at once. And he's still not admitted to world that he's gay, and probably never will. Upvote for a different definition of badass. Well, my great uncle worked as muscle for the Kray twins, infamous London gangsters. He moved from Ireland when he was about 15-16. Worked in the construction industry for a while until one day when he was in a pub with his mates and a well-dressed man in a whistle and flute walked up and asked the boys if they wanted to make a bit of cash. They said okay and he handed them each £50, which was a frick ton of money back in the day. The geezer tells them to be at the pub at the same time the next night. So, they show up and a big butt trunk pulls up and they all pile in. The gent is sitting in the back with them and tells them that they're going to a pool hall and their job is to wreck the place. The lads don't know what to make of this, but cash is cash, so they go along with it. The truck stops and they're told that there's bats and crap in the boot. They grab them, rush into the hall and start to smash the crap out of tables, the bar and pretty much everything and everyone. When they finish, they get driven back to the pub with an extra 50 quid each. This kinda pattern went on for a few years. Small jobs that didn't really require much brain, mostly brawn. They also got access to the Kray twins bar or something. At one stage my uncle was almost arrested because he resembled the twins' chief executioner. He only got away because he had the letters from his dear old mammy back home in Ireland to prove that it wasn't him. TL. DR. Uncle was a thug in London. Looking back now, it don't seem very bad but seems more douchy. But hey, it's a good story. Not everyone's relatives can be heroes. I am often told I am descended horse thieves. I guess my mom's side of the family doesn't have a lot to be proud of. My granddad, my mother's father, as is important, as a Garda in Ireland, protected the British embassy when a mob of people came to burn it down after Bloody Sunday in 1972. The twist being my father, who had yet to meet my maternal grandfather, was in the mob trying to burn it down. My granddad had this to say about the whole thing. An empty building for the lives of 14 people was a poor deal. My granddad punched a man through a shed wall who pointed a gun at him when he was working in the Palestine police. He knocked his front 2 teeth out on the recoil on a machine gun while gunning down some Huns in World War II. When 74, he made a 30-something guy road rage and the dude started screaming through the driver's side window at him. Cool as a button, he just opened his door very fast into the guy's face and put him down. He has loads of medals for boxing in the army. Seems he was pretty dang good at it when he was a PT instructor. He made a fair bit of money in his time and blew it on dog racing and drinking. He won £100,000 on the premium bonds in his late 70s and bought a fricking boat. When I knew him as a child, he smiled a lot, always had time to chat with you, and I never once in the 22 years I knew him heard him raise his voice. R.I.P. Fred, I wish I knew thee better. Freaking boats are also better than abstinence boats. My granddad was a pilot in World War II. When he came back, instead of going to church on Sundays, he would ride around his small crop duster underneath all the bridges in town, making a general racket and not giving men a fricks, if any at all. He was a G. That's so cool. My paternal great-grandfather worked as the Capone family's personal bartender during Prohibition, and he sold it while my maternal great-grandfather brewed it. They met at my parents' wedding over 60 years later. My grandfather was a revolutionary in Bangladesh. When they were fighting for their independence, he was always on the run because he was a primary target. Anyway, the one story that sticks out is when he jumped off a 3-story building, broke his leg and still kept running limping from the military. Oh, and he's been to prison a few times for refusing to renounce his language, Bangla, and speak Urdu. I honestly wish I knew more details, but my grandpa was an advocate for Ziaur Rahman at the time, more in the political side, and grandpa's brother was a prisoner of war for being a spy. Nobody talks about his time in jail though. My mom and her sister have shrapnel scars from some bombing during the time as well. My grandfather and grandmother were communists in German-occupied Europe. My grandfather once told me of how they helped Jews hide from the Germans and how they helped spread resistance newspapers, pamphlets. My great-grandparents did the same in Holland. My great-granddad was a peat farmer and would hide Jews in the peat fields. Got taken away by the Gestapo 3 times, came back every time, then fled to Australia. My grandparents have been married over 60 years, and in failing health they are still able to love and look after each other. My grandfather genuinely loved his wife, and never cheated on her or even wanted any other woman. I hear so many Mad Men type stories from that generation. So much pain. Proud to say he was one of the good ones. Same with my grandfather. Seemed after his wife died that he just had up. He left us yesterday. My grandmother is 96 and grew up in Texas. She didn't do anything badass, but she is badass. I once saw the guy shooting at a car outside of my window. It kind of shook me, I have to be honest. I thought I would blow her mind with this story. Her response: "That reminds me of the time I saw a man get shot. Reminds me of the other time I saw a man shot to death in the face." She repeatedly reminds me of her badassery. I remember it because it was a great day. Our family had an orange for dessert. Grew up in Texas during the Depression. Badass. Love your G. My grandfather was a fighter pilot in World War II. His plane was shot and he had to bail. As he was abandoning the plane, he pulled the parachute cord, but the door on his plane caught his leg. He lost half his leg as the parachute pulled him up and the plane pulled his leg down. He landed somewhere in Italy and had to go into hiding until he was rescued. Pretty bad, but in my mind. My great uncle served in World War II, Korea and Vietnam. In Vietnam he got shot in the head and survived. He had to have a metal plate in his head, but he lived a long time. My grandmother worked as ticket taker on a streetcar in Nazi-occupied Norway. She kicked a fully armed Nazi soldier off the streetcar for refusing to pay. She physically removed him. Single-handedly held off several Japanese soldiers with a machine gun, while the rest of his squad retreated. He got a medal for it. I can't remember which one. My grandmother told her parents that she was in student government or something, but really she got a job filling bombs in a factory during World War II. Lied to the factory about only being 15 too. My grandfather's favorite story about her: in the 60s in Mississippi, she held a door for a black man as she was leaving a building and he was going in. Some white guy told her she shouldn't do that and she just looked him right in the eye and said, "I will do whatever I goddamn please, especially if it pisses off buttholes like you." After my great-grandmother died, both her husband and her ex, her children's father, died long ago. My grandmother and her sisters went through her house to sort out the belongings. They found numerous order forms and request letters for whiskey, wine, moonshine, ect along with wads of cash with them. Granny was astounded that her sweet old grandpa was the area's best bootlegger during the Prohibition. A few years ago my grandma went skydiving. Her first chute didn't open. In a few weeks she is taking me whitewater rafting. She's 76. He wasn't my grandpa but an older man I knew was in World War II and he had some bad butt stories. Dropped behind enemy positions and shelled them on D-Day. Hid in the basement of a Nazi outpost and survived by eating bats. Eventually grabbed one of the girls who came down periodically for supplies and made her divulge information and get them out of there. Escaped from a POW camp on Christmas Day by running for a break in the fence during drills. Got shot at it for nearly 2 miles before he made away. Escaped from a prison hospital by jumping out of a second-story window and stealing a German car. Swung around the corner of a building to a German with their MP40. Quickly hit him with the butt of his Tommy gun, knocking him out. He then interrogated the guy and got him to defect. I remember I interviewed him for a school project and he gave me some stuff to show to the class. An artillery shell from D-Day, a Nazi field marshal helmet and a Hitler Youth knife. Yeah, I had the best presentation. I was told that in World War II the government was sending horse meat from my grandpa's dog food company to the soldiers. The story is that he switched the horse meat out for high quality beef when he could. My mother was born and raised in Turkey on a military base, US base. Blue jeans were illegal in Turkey at the time, and marijuana was hard to get on the base. My mom, being the crafty teenager she was, became a dealer. She sold American blue jeans to Turks and marijuana to Americans. Blue jeans were illegal in Turkey. The frick. But yeah, your mom is cool. My grandfather and my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were major leaders in the labor movement of the first half of the 20th century. We got my grandpa's FBI file when he died. It was 3 inches thick. My grandma was attacked in the Cultural Revolution. She was the principal of a high school in Beijing. She's also suffered a lot of loss through the deaths of her siblings. I think the fact that she has no resentment and is still so gentle, lovely and patient makes her pretty badass. Also, my grandpa learned Russian in a couple of months and wrote his thesis in Russian. This was when the USSR and China were still friends. I find that pretty badass too. My grandmother left my grandfather with the 4 kids. Just freaking left and didn't come back for 3 months. People didn't do that in the early 60s. It was enough to teach him his lesson, and when she came back their relationship was much more solid. I found out yesterday that my grandpa designed and built radio jammers for B-52s in the 60s. Once, he flipped one on just to see if it worked, and it knocked out every TV station in the city instantly. Oh dear, I'm too late to the thread. Anyway, my grandma was an activist in the South during the time when integration was kicking off. As a teen, she would steal the white and colored signs off the bus and hide them under her house. When integration finally reached the public schools, and black kids were allowed into the previously all-white schools, most of the white families pulled their kids out of school. The ones who stayed were assaulted and stoned on their way to school. My grandma was one of many volunteers who helped drive and escort them to school so they wouldn't be hurt. She would tell me how sorry she felt for Ruby Bridges, who was all alone at school, and how she wanted so badly to give her a hug. She recently met Ruby and got a hug. When he was 16, my Zoyeda, Yiddish for grandfather, lied about his age and enlisted in the Marines so that he could fight in World War II. He was first stationed in Shanghai to help Jewish refugees. After Shanghai, he was sent to combat in Europe. While there, he was injured when some shrapnel from an explosion embedded itself in the back of his neck, leg, and knee. My other grandpa was in the Navy stationed off of Asia's coast. My dad is 76, so I think this applies. He lived in communist Hungary until the revolution of 1956, when he escaped to Austria and then England in the middle of the night with absolutely nothing. In England, he applied for college and a scholarship as a refugee. The organization that would grant him a scholarship wanted him to wait a year to learn English before going to a college. He didn't speak it at all, but he fought tooth and nail with them. They ended up giving him a train ticket, which he had no idea where it was to. He went down to the train station, asked a conductor for help, ended up getting on the right train, and ended up in Scotland, where he studied at St. Andrews and got a degree in chemistry. I think that's pretty badass in itself. From there he immigrated to the United States, got a PhD in chemistry, got a degree in medicine, and became a doctor. The fact that he did this all starting from literally nothing amazes me. Man, he has so many crazy and awesome stories. My grandparents smuggled tens of thousands of US dollars into East Germany, where they were traded on the black market, resulting in the passage for hundreds of people into West Germany. As a policeman, my grandfather caught 2 murderers and a few mafia members. He once used my 8-year-old dad to trail a suspect. My grandfather worked, indirectly, with Gandhi in helping India gain independence from England. He's the only member of my family, to my knowledge, to be arrested for any reason. Killed a bunch of Nazis. We never could get much out of him, until the Alzheimer's got bad. But yeah, lots of Nazi killing. My grandfather told me that when he was young his brother used to cry all the time, and when he cried he was always looking up with his mouth open. One day my grandpa was on the balcony of his house and his brother started crying right underneath it. So my grandpa decided to pee on him to make it stop. Don't know if this is bad, but it made me laugh for days when he told me. Another story related to the Second World War. My grandpa in fascist Italy received the call for the army. However, because he hated the fascists and believed that war was stupid, he ran away and hid in the mountain. There he studied and immediately after the war got his degree. This meant that he was one of the few people qualified to teach Italian in my town. He got a place in the local high school and he worked there until retirement. Again, don't know if this is bad, but I'm so proud of him. Grandpa, rest in peace, you will be my hero forever. My grandpa drove home from a nightclub in LA, a nightclub in the 30s, in the car of the most dangerous mobster around. The mistake occurred because they had the same car, but the car my grandpa drove home that night had a plethora of guns in the trunk. My Grammy burnt her eyebrows off with fire batons when she was younger. It used to scare the crap out of me when I would see her in the morning before she penciled them on. She always looked so surprised. My grandmother sent her father to jail. She was 8 and he was making moonshine of rural Ohio, and the police came and asked her where her daddy was and she said, out back making moonshine. It'll take you to him. She took their hands and led them to the backwoods where he was promptly arrested and went to jail for 5 years. TLDR. My grandma is a snitch. Grandpa was a Peace Corps administrator, civil rights activist, and, later, an openly gay man in a hostile political and social climate, and of course an activist for gay rights. Marched with MLK Jr., negotiated with warlords in Niger, served in Korea only to later oppose the war in Vietnam. He was the best. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.